So weird about this. All right, we're recording. Okay. All right, welcome to Wild Exchange, weekly insight, listening, and dialogue. Really excited to have you all here on a Friday afternoon when it's raining. It's nice to just be in conversation together. Andy and Keaton are presenting this week's topic, looking at philanthropy and charity, charity work in corporations, and so understanding what the impact that corporations have on philanthropy and charity, and how that can, in the greater sense, impacts our society on the whole. So these two grad students are here to present on that topic. If you have any questions, raise your hand. I'm sure Andy and Keaton will answer those, and then Natalie, Doug, and I will keep an eye out for any questions too in the chat and make sure that we get those to you as well. All right, take it away, Andy and Keaton.
All right, yeah, so this is kind of a topic that's come up in our classes in grad school, and so we kind of wanted to have a discussion on it because we find it really interesting how kind of large corporations interact with the nonprofit world, and how it's kind of shifting from the traditional nonprofit sense to more of these large corporations trying to make positive impact, and kind of where the lines blur on that.
Let me know if you need this.
I think Keaton.
I'm changing your screen sharing.
But I can only see myself. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I was on the wrong. I don't know if we had the wrong link or whatever, but then my computer wouldn't let me join. So I'm gonna pull up a presentation. Let's see. Andy, I don't know how much you talked about why we wanted to do this specifically.
Yeah, I just gave a little brief intro saying that it's something that's come up in our classes, and just kind of how the nonprofit world is kind of shifting, and how corporations are starting to take on more philanthropic efforts.
Perfect. Yeah, and for me, I think it was both the nonprofit class we took and just seeing like what nonprofits and charities and different like philanthropic ventures are tasked with solving, involving like homelessness and poverty and like these huge social issues that haven't been solved yet and are kind of far away from being solved. And kind of what we talked about in our class was that maybe we need a different approach to these issues. And so kind of laying the groundwork for that. But once let's see, share.
I guess I had a question real quick. So
yeah,
would this also involve how inflation is taking place, how corporate is making money even during the pandemic, and how prices are really being jacked up, gas, food, everything else? Is this tied to anything?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of, we were doing some like statistical research just into how the pandemic has affected giving and how it's affected how much corporations give or keep, or kind of how they divide it. And from what I could find this year, so the last fiscal year, I guess ending in 2021 in January, Americans have given more to charity and philanthropic ventures than any year before. It was like $427 billion, but only 20% of that was from like Fortune 1000 companies. And so a lot of it was from like private foundations or just individuals instead of these companies that have, although the biggest donor this last year was Pfizer. So, which makes sense considering they had like a 850% increase in their revenue. So, but we have a slide that will talk all about this. Let's see. Can you guys see my screen?
It was up. For a
It was
second.
there. For a
Yeah.
second.
A second.
Huh.
Yeah, but and then you're on mute. But it was weird.
Yeah, I had to join like from my browser, and I think it's being all. Let's see. Share. All right. Now you guys can see it and hear me.
Yep.
All right, sweet. So it's not actually 18 slides. I just forgot to delete all the extra ones. But so first I wanted to start with, this was kind of the video that I think inspired us to take on this topic. If you haven't seen this WildX, I would suggest watching the whole thing. It really kind of paints a picture of the nonprofit world and how it's been running and how it needs to change. But we're just going to watch a little, about like 3-minute clip to kind of set some foundation for the discussion.
But it doesn't seem to be working. Why have our breast cancer charities not come close to finding a cure for breast cancer, or our homeless charities not come close to ending homelessness in any major city? Why has poverty remained stuck at 12% of the US population for 40 years? And the answer is, these social problems are massive in scale. Our organizations are tiny up against them, and we have a belief system that keeps them tiny. We have 2 rule books. We have one for the nonprofit sector and one for the rest of the economic world. It's an apartheid, and it discriminates against the for-profit sector in 5 different areas, the first being compensation. So in the for-profit sector, the more value you produce, the more money you can make. But we don't like nonprofits to use money to incentivize people to produce more in social service. We have a visceral reaction to the idea that anyone would make very much money helping other people. Interesting that we don't have a visceral reaction to the notion that people would make a lot of money not helping other people. You know, you want to make $50 million selling violent video games to kids, go for it. We'll put you on the cover of Wired magazine, but you want to make $500,000 trying to cure kids of malaria, and you're considered a parasite yourself. And we think of this as our system of ethics, but what we don't realize is that this system has a powerful side effect, which is it gives a really stark, mutually exclusive choice between doing very well for yourself and your family or doing good for the world to the brightest minds coming out of our best universities, and sends tens of thousands of people who could make a huge difference in the nonprofit sector, marching every year directly into the for-profit sector because they're not willing to make that kind of lifelong economic sacrifice. Business Week did a survey, looked at the compensation packages for MBAs 10 years out of business school. And the median compensation for a Stanford MBA with bonus at the age of 38 was $400,000. Meanwhile, for the same year, the average salary for the CEO of a $5 million plus medical charity in the US was $232,000, and for a hunger charity, $84,000. Now, there's no way you're going to get a lot of people with $400,000 talent to make a $316,000 sacrifice every year to become the CEO of a hunger charity. Some people say, well, that's just because those MBA types are greedy. Not necessarily. They might be smart. It's cheaper for that person to donate $100,000 every year to the hunger charity, save $50,000 on their taxes, so still be roughly $270,000 a year ahead of the game. Now be called a philanthropist because they donated $100,000 to charity, probably sit on the board of the hunger charity, indeed probably supervise the poor SOB who decided to become the CEO of the hunger charity, and have a lifetime of this kind of power and influence and popular praise still ahead of them.
So that was kind of he goes on to explore like 5 other or 6 other differences between the for-profit and nonprofit sectors that are driving people away from the nonprofit sector, and just doesn't have, how they don't have the funds or the resources to attack these problems that they're tasked with. And so when I share my screen, does it just share, like, because now I'm back on Zoom, but you can't see whatever.
Yeah, I'm
I'll
like
just,
I'm seeing myself like picture in picture. It's
yeah,
really
I'm just
awkward.
gonna go like this.
Perfect.
So I can't see you guys, but it's okay.
Okay, yeah, you're good.
Yeah. So, what the? So one of the first things we learned in class was just the simple difference between charity and philanthropy. So the idea that charity is more of like a short-term, natural, emotional impulse sort of giving, that it's to immediate cause, usually in the form of monetary donations or volunteering. And so like you think of your local food drive, you donate like $10 when you check out at Albertsons, that's like charity. Whereas philanthropy is more of a strategic, long-term approach that's attacking like the root cause of an issue. So most of the things that like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation donates to, or building a school in a certain area, some of those investments and approaches that are going to solve something more long-term. And then a little bit of breakdown of the nonprofit sector. So you can see there like 40% of the nonprofits in America are churches, schools, and foundations. And then all the way down to 7% of nonprofits represent cultural humanity nonprofits, which I think it's an interesting percentage breakdown, because it seems like in terms of like large scale social issues, the smaller percentage of nonprofits are geared towards solving those. And then these were just the three largest nonprofits in America. So YMCA, Goodwill, and the Catholic Charities USA. This was from, so Natalie, you're not allowed to answer this question because I know you read that article, but looking at these percentages, does anyone have a guess on like what these percentages are of? Like 92% of CEOs of foundations are, they all are all of the same category.
White male.
Yes.
White
So,
Thomas.
yeah. So specifically white. So 92% of CEOs of foundations are white. And then through all the way through the line, 86% of venture capitalist investors. And so really, I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen now. Really what the article that Natalie sent us, which was a great read, talked about how, and I think it's been talked about in a lot of different industries, but the idea that he starts the article by saying that 8 to 9% of grants are given to like people of color or organizations that are going to help people of color, and that they want to change that, but the only way to change that is to change who has the power of giving those grants and who has the power to invest in those different organizations. And so I think where Andy and I kind of settled is like, what do you guys think about the structure of solving these issues, like how nonprofits approach homelessness and poverty, and the role that big corporations have in it? And then is there a path forward? Do we have to like change our mindset in that? We learned about a new idea / sector in class that we want to talk about, but first kind of want to hear some thoughts on just the industry as a whole before we represent that or bring that up.
I appreciate just the really calling out the starkness of those two mindsets, bringing them forward to talk about of, are we choosing right now is the culture to choose to do well for yourself or choose to do well for others? And when looking at that, salary breakdown and what, how that person with an MBA making $400,000 can actually come out better reputation wise, financially, tax wise, all that, if they're just donating to a nonprofit, and what that does to that contradicted with the person who's taking the lower paying job and in the trenches trying to get this work done. It's beyond those it goes beyond just that dynamic. That I think about, like, you know, Doug and I here all in all day long, and we are a not-for-profit school. So we are a nonprofit, right? And so you have the same dynamic of, like, we do it for all these other reasons. We do it we're never in it for the pay. We hear that all the time here. And it's very true about the jobs that we have here, but it also, at what point does it really start to impact your mindset, if that's just okay, that the people in those roles that are trying to make a difference in the community, it's just okay that they just don't get paid that much. That's just understood that that's the way it works. And that's sad. That's a sad commentary on where we are, that we expect that.
Well, Kate and Andy, first that come to mind, I think about taxes. Are people who are making that money paying their share of taxes and held accountable for how much they make? And then I think about benefits and that working for a nonprofit, you know, incentives. I think some have done where you don't have to pay your student loan, or housing, some benefits or perks that would help nonprofit organizations.
Yeah, I think honestly, before taking the nonprofits class, I felt like I ended up realizing that I didn't know much about nonprofits. Like, in my mind going into that class, I was like, oh, nonprofits, like, they can't earn a profit, which then I learned, like, okay, they can earn a profit, but it can't be distributed to the people that run the company, the executives. Like, a certain percentage of it has to go towards back into their mission. And so I think it's the structure of nonprofits is one that seems to be just not built for solving long-term problems. Because when you have people, like, I think the will to pursue a mission like that, just for pursuing the mission and just for creating social change, can only take you so far. Like, at some point you do need resources, and whether it's being compensated for the work you're doing, or just resources in marketing what you're doing and bringing in more funds. Like, to bring in more funds, you need to spend money to get your message out there. And under the structure of nonprofits right now, and how closely they're watched and how closely they're audited, there's no room for that. And so they're kind of like stuck at this point where they're not able to grow big enough to the point where they can solve these issues. I mean, like, homelessness and poverty, those are issues that, like, the whole world needs to tackle. And these nonprofits that all focus on that, one, they're all separate entities. And so they're not combining their efforts, and they can't combine their efforts to solve it. And so I think it's I walked away from that class thinking that we have to take on some new approach, whether it's restructuring the nonprofit world, or rethinking how we use the money that is donated. And I think that's another thing that article talked about, Natalie, was that a lot of these companies have all of this philanthropic funding, and they're like, oh yeah, we're making grants for like environmental causes, yet all of that grant money is invested in, like, fossil fuel or big oil companies. And so aligning the investment and where the funds are coming from with the mission is something that's often missed in the corporate world, that they kind of can make these grants as, like, oh yeah, check the box, like, we made these grants, but their money is not where their mouth is, in terms of kind of digging down to the root cause.
Yeah, I'm glad you, like, mentioned, like, homelessness and poverty, like, too. It's like who should be responsible for fixing that problem, right? And it feels weird that it has to be kind of a charity. And I also too wonder about, when I was in grad school, that was when I kind of first learned about nonprofits, and people are like, this amount of your donation will actually go to, like, kind of the cause versus going to, like, overhead and kind of upkeep and things like that. And it's basically been corporate corporatized, at some of these levels, like the Red Cross and those kind of things. But then there's also understanding, like, to try to do this work, like there needs to be resources put into that other pieces. You can't just donate to the cause directly sometimes. But I also wonder about kind of the uprise of like crowdfunding. Like, you see people who are doing like GoFundMe's and things like that when they're like, for medical bills. And it's like, and if I know there's been times when I've donated to something like that, or something that's like more of a kind of a more grassroots, but that's probably taking away from some other donation I'm making. But yeah, it's very fragmented, I feel like, the entire industry, and it is frustrating. I think that there is so much, like so many great organizations out there, but it seems like it could definitely be a little more streamlined.
It seems like too, we're still operating in a capitalist society too.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at like when I worked for the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, we were constantly making sure that it was clear to people that we spent no more than 25% of the donations that we took in towards overhead. And we had to say that over and over and over again. But then it became a competitive thing. Then you got like the American Cancer Organization that was only spending 22%. And then it was like, and you started like chasing after each other, when really, all told, I mean, I was coaching for them for 5 months and I would make $1,200. So it was like, we were not spending a lot of money on overhead, but it became this because nonprofits reveal they have to do quarterly reports, same as a corporation, and have to put all that information out there. It turns into this competitive thing too, when really, should nonprofits actually be on that? Should they be on that standard? Should there be multiple nonprofits trying to make a change in one area when they're all competing with each other anyway, and they're competing on a standard that applies to business but it shouldn't actually apply? It's going back to what you're saying, Keaton, like there's not a whole lot of communication or partnership within the nonprofits that are working on the same issue, right? That they're in competition with each other to solve a problem.
Yeah, and that overhead, that's something we talked about in class, how the word overhead in the nonprofit world is like, it's like a death sentence. Like there's these not communities, but there's these like watchdog organizations that their primary job is to look at how much each nonprofit is spending on overhead, which in my mind is ridiculous, because you can't run a business without overhead. Like you have to pay rent and keep lights on and pay employees, and that's what overhead is. And so the idea that you're asking these nonprofits to tackle issues that are as big or bigger than what for-profit companies are doing, yet you're not letting them operate like a for-profit company. You're not letting them spend money on marketing or spend money on research and development. And so there's only so many ways to pursue and solve those issues. If you're not allowed, you're just handicapped. And so one of those things that's changing, one of the new like emergence out of that idea is this idea called the fourth sector. And I don't know if anyone's heard of that or seen it in news articles or anything. So basically the idea that right now we have 3 sectors. We have public, private, and nonprofit. And that the fourth sector would be this combination of the private sector and like nonprofit and public goals. And so a company that would be able to pursue these social issues with for-profit strategy and kind of like seamlessly combine them, which sounds great in theory, but I think is a lot harder to do. And the first kind of example we've seen of it is the Zuckerberg initiative. So I don't know if you guys have heard of that or know what it is. Obviously, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife created an LLC, so not a nonprofit, not a private foundation, but an actual company that is completely funded by them to tackle, I think it started as they had a 100-year goal of curing all disease and providing like long-term medical benefits. but because it's an LLC, they can invest like a normal company, and they can act like a normal company, but they have the mission and the goal of like a socially driven nonprofit. And we had like long debates in class about it, because some people were like, well, like, is it just like a tax write-off form? Is it all like the normal kind of conversations you hear about that when any billionaire creates a foundation like that? But I think ultimately the view I took on it was that people like Zuckerberg and Bezos and these very wealthy billionaires, like, we always ask them to do more with their money, and then when they do something with their money, we criticize because it's never enough. Or we, like, in my mind, Zuckerberg already, with Facebook, he changed the world for good or for bad. That's like a different conversation, but he changed the world with that invention. And so now he has the money and the influence and the connection to do that again. So why don't we give him the chance to do that with this organization? And that, I think I don't know. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to ramble.
No,
but that's
I was just thinking,
yeah.
it's like part of me gets frustrated when you see Zuckerberg and some of these guys that like, and girls too, but like, it's instead of just giving their money to the places that could really like use it and have the expertise, I think they have to start their own thing, right? And that, I think, is frustrating to me, is that like that there's just plenty of people out there with the expertise. It's not that it's not that they don't know what they're doing, it's just they don't have the money, right? So I think that's a disconnect for sure. And I also, did you guys talk about the NCAA at all in this class?
So that was we had to research. We were researching something about nonprofits, some form, and I looked up the NCAA, and just I think it's the like form 990, where they have to report their 28 like highest earners, and it's just ridiculous. That I mean, the money their executives make for, like, I don't think people think of the NCAA as a nonprofit just because it's constantly advertised how much money they bring in, but they are a nonprofit. And so they really don't fit in the realm of what we think of as a normal nonprofit. I mean, their NCAA tournament alone brings in billions of dollars, and it's pretty heavily distributed to their executives. So yeah, it's
all because of education, right? Like that's,
yeah, exactly.
Like academic, it's quote, academic excellence is what they are placing an emphasis on. And Jane and I don't know if Doug was on this one, but Jane and Gary and I were on a call yesterday with they're kind of retooling their entire constitution, and they're trying to basically adapt because everyone's criticized them so much. And I say them too because it's funny because this is what always kills me too. It's like people are like them, the NCAA, and like, yeah, there are executives, but then it's presidents and athletic directors, and like it's not just like this one like conglomerate of people. It's still this, yeah. It's probably one of the most complicated nonprofits you could think of.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even realize it was a nonprofit until I looked it up, because I was just looking up like biggest nonprofits, or like, because I wanted to see, because we had just learned about the Form 990 and how they had to report all this stuff, and so I wanted to see what larger organizations looked like, and it was like NCAA. I was like, oh wait, yeah, that's a nonprofit, even though they profit a lot.
Yeah, and then the other one, like for me with that, is like finding out that the NFL up until just a few years ago was also a nonprofit. Like that one just blew my mind, because I mean they totally operate in the for-profit world, really.
Well, and then it's just I think they exemplified the disparities of the the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer in those situations, even if it's individual schools and teams and owners. It's wild. I'm curious though if anyone else on the call too has any experience with nonprofits or like super involved with any organizations.
One thing we also learned about how, like, instead of having to switch completely toward like a fourth sector where you kind of get rid of the idea of a nonprofit altogether, is having business ventures between nonprofits and for-profits where you can leverage the marketing ability and resources of a for-profit, but you don't have to go outside like the guidelines of a normal nonprofit. And so we looked at all sorts of partnerships between certain nonprofits and for-profit companies that work in tandem, and it always isn't like a perfect marriage, but I think it seems like the industry is trying to get more creative and look for different ways to solve these issues that have been around for a long time. And there's no perfect answer, and it's not on one sector or group of people, but yeah.
I think how unconventional it would be, and how radical it would be for a few nonprofits to say, we pay our CEO $500,000 a year, and this is the output we expect that we every year. This is what we will, you know what I mean? Like how amazing would that be if somebody could be, if nonprofits could be upfront about what they pay their people, because these are the expectations we have of our organization, and this is what these are 2022 goals, these are 2023 goals. It would be amazing, instead of like feeling embarrassed by what you might make.
Yeah, and I think ultimately that's what needs to happen. Like these right now, nonprofit like CEOs, their salary and their compensation can't be tied at all to the performance of the nonprofit, which I don't know, like it doesn't quite align with trying to innovate and grow and solve these bigger issues. Because if you do have a CEO that, okay, they're making, like in that case, the charity, hunger charity CEO, he's making like $84,000, and then no matter how much it grows and how much impact he has, that company, no one in the company is benefiting from that. And which is also hard though, because that's like the whole basis of nonprofits, is that like it's not a for-profit business. You're not trying to enhance your own wealth through the performance of the company, but there's got to be some middle ground where maybe it's not directly tied to the performance of the nonprofit, but you are being compensated more, and you are yeah, and I think that's a great point.
Yeah, don't you think or wonder that some of that just cultural, to say that you can't tie it to an organization's goals or achievements for the year is part of the mentality of, you got to be humble. If you're in nonprofit work, got to be humble. It's not about you, it's about them. It's about the cause, it's about the other people. Like even at Linfield, I think about, like president's salaries in the Northwest Conference or at any school, that's public knowledge that is shared publicly. And we do, as a university, we do talk about our achievements, but it's always centered back into put the students first. And we do put the students first, but it's always about that, right? It's not about us, it's about the students. But I wonder how much of that is regulation or a mindset that we don't tie it to certain outcomes, or regulations that are spurred from that mindset of that we have to be humble. We think back to like thinking back to missionaries back in the 1700s or 1800s, and it was all about the mission. It's not about them personally, and I have no idea what they got compensated. But is it that far back? Is it that deeply rooted in our psyche that we just do it for other people's glory, not to sing our own praises?
I
And I
just
don't
wanted to clarify something. Are you saying that nonprofit CEOs, just that they can't get compensation that's based on organizational goals? Because an organization can hire and fire somebody based on whether the, right? I mean, I'm like, it's not
Yeah,
totally divorced from the performance of the organization.
yeah. And I think from my understanding of what we learned was that, like, when you have a CEO of like for Apple, like he has like 50% of his compensation is tied up in their stock. And so you can't have any compensation. You can't, like, a nonprofit CEO can't have a bonus if they reach a certain goal, or if it can't be tied to their performance, which is interesting though, because like you said, if the board deems that they're not doing their job, they can be fired for that. So, yeah. And I think back to your point, Jane, about like, is it a cultural or regulation thing? I think the TED Talk, he just hits on that, like, that we're completely fine with a for-profit CEO making millions of dollars off of some like video game or something, but if it comes out that the CEO of a nonprofit is making half as much money, that we have like a visceral reaction to it. And it's an interesting, and I think it's because of how we've been taught to view the nonprofit industry.
It's kind of like what you talked about earlier, Jane, like when you were working in like the competition of who has the lowest margins. It's like we're always like, even I think most people do, like when you look to donate to a charity, you're looking to see like who makes the least amount of money. And so you're driving that competition also by how we donate to different charities. And I think if we start looking at that differently, like obviously takes time, and that's kind of the shift, but looking at that to see, who's actually doing the most good with their money, and not necessarily focusing on, like who has the lowest margins.
And then, if we need to use marketing dollars to like, Natalie was saying, if she donates to this charity, is that money that isn't going to another charity for her this year? Because there's so many nonprofits out there. And so if we're supporting nonprofits with more of a marketing budget so that they can get the word out, but we're still in this competitive environment where there's probably more nonprofits than can be effective on one particular area, then are we then at that point, do we need to look at the overhead, or how much are we spending on marketing and getting our name out there so that we can collect donations, when really that field might be saturated with nonprofits? And how effective can that be?
I'm kind of curious how this relates to the conversation. I think not, I don't know that we've had this here, but in general, there's been a conversation about how much compensation CEOs in the for-profit sector get, and are they really bringing that much value to their companies, especially, the CEO compensation relative to the frontline worker. But are we saying in this conversation that nonprofits should operate more like that to get the talent at the top? I mean, do we think that makes that much difference? I don't know.
I think CEOs across the board make an exorbitant amount of money. That is, like, I think just the more we learn about how teams operate, and like Apple's success isn't based off of what their CEO brings to the table. Like, Apple is built. It's already, everything's established. Obviously they're looking to innovate and grow, but he's not the one making every single decision and creating the new iPhone. But because he's the face of Apple, he gets compensated like 50% more than anyone else next to him. And so I think in general, CEOs, the wealth needs to be distributed more amongst the company and the people who make a big difference in the company along with the CEO. But at the same time, I think nonprofit CEOs need to make just more in general, not necessarily even more compared to the rest of the nonprofit, but everyone in the nonprofit industry needs to be compensated more. Because I do think it attracts more. I think it just attracts more workers in general. Like it's not even, obviously the nonprofit world wants to attract talent from those, like the TED Talk was talking about, but just the idea that a lot of nonprofits have to rely on volunteers, and volunteers aren't always there. And so if your business is run like, I mean, the idea of nonprofit, like you're relying on volunteers and you're relying on resources from elsewhere. And if those dry up, or if you don't always have that, it's hard to consistently pursue a mission. But yeah, I think it's a great, I mean, a lot of CEOs make, I think the more you dive into it, the crazier it kind of gets, the percentages of like even the CEO to the COO, like that's the CEO title seems like it has like a 40% raise from any other position just with it. So.
And I don't think it's necessarily like about paying like the nonprofit CEOs like that excess amount, but paying them, you know, more of a competitive salary to where you are attracting some more talent, but still, you know, not paying that ridiculously excessive amount, but, you know, not also like a livable wage and enough to bring in the talent and compete with, you know, more, I guess, just to achieve those goals, you know, like.
Yeah, and that's like the way the nonprofit world has evolved over the last 10 years is that the industry as a whole and the way the companies are run are just, it's more competitive, it's more like a for-profit industry, and they're dealing with the same issues and going through the same problems, if not on like a bigger scale, yet they aren't getting compensated nearly as much. And so like their day-to-day could look the exact same, like if not more, in terms of workload and problem solving issues they're going through, and different, just the day-to-day life of the CEOs has become very comparable, yet compensation could not be further from comparable. So it's closing that gap, and I think it both takes lowering, yeah.
It is crazy, like just thinking about semantics, because like you said, nonprofit, and I mean, I think for any organization to be successful, they need to make money, and they need to have a steady cash flow, and they need just to do what they want to do. I think everything takes resources, and so that's kind of, I think, yeah, kind of a misnomer. And I think too, like not just CEOs, but just like like you said, frontline, you're like kind of people that are in the trenches doing that work. I have known so many people who have wanted to do this kind of work, but they just can't afford to live. Like they can't afford to live off of that kind of, or they have to do it part-time or on the side. And it's really sad, because it's like, man, it's such important work. But I've seen, especially this past couple of years, I've seen so many people leave the nonprofit world and even like college sports too, specifically because the pay is so bad, and like they've gone to like do on the kind of the venture capital, or like gone to do kind of more of the like lucrative jobs. And it's sad, but it's like that's kind of the reality. And it's like kind of shows like what do we as a society value? Like, do we value like doing important work that nonprofits do, or do we value kind of corporate and, you know, each man for himself? And it's kind of discouraging and sad. And I kind of agree, kind of like what NCAA's, I always go back to NCAA and like college, but it's kind of this reckoning point. And I think it's almost the same with this kind of corporate setup as, you know, like Doug was talking about earlier, with how the inflation and how the corporations are impacted. And it almost feels like it's at a breaking point where things need to be completely kind of start from scratch. And like, how do we, because we have so many brilliant people out there, but how do we kind of try to not just put a band-aid on something, but like actually like fix the problem? I don't know, but yeah, it's super interesting.
And I think there's certain for-profit companies that do exemplify that merging between pursuing a social issue and being pretty hardcore about like, this is the issue we're addressing, and we're not going to let profitability get in the way of that. And I think one of those companies is Patagonia.
Exactly
and
what I was just thinking. I was going to say, did you guys talk about Patagonia?
yeah, and I don't know if we necessarily talked about it in class, but I feel like just through the years, anytime there's a project on like sustainable companies or anything, I always pick them, just because like we see the profitability of the clothing industry, and you look at a brand like Nike, and just like every day there's a new clothing company, and it's a very lucrative industry, and they have a stronghold on this certain market share of it, yet they don't sacrifice their pursuit of their environmental mission chasing that profitability. Like they could be one of the biggest clothing, I mean they still are, but in terms of profitability and like market share, they could just be through the roof. But the founder's values and the mission that he set forth has kind of held strong through that, which is inspiring to see, I think, because it feels like they haven't been touched yet by the need to chase that profitability.
Yeah, and it's kind of wild because I don't think like maybe the more general public would know as much, but like because like when people see the price tag, they're just like, what? And it's like, but then you understand like, oh, I'm paying because they're like actually making, like they're not like they don't have kids making their product overseas, and they don't like they like recycle, like they do try to recycle everything. And like I was looking at something on their website, and it was like trade in your old stuff. And I actually got to go visit their campus. One kind of cool thing, kind of going back to kind of our overall societal things that's been talked about a lot is childcare, right? Like have the availability of childcare for professional, like for everyone. And how it's just the United States is just so far behind in that space. And Patagonia has a child, basically like a daycare within their company that's where those employees of the daycare are treated just like every other like Patagonia employee. They're actually, I think, treated a little bit better in some cases. Like they're given a lot of autonomy, and they they provide this service to their employees, and it's a little bit different than Nike's and some of the other corporations, because it's just so like if you're a breastfeeding mom, they'll like send I can't remember what they called them, but like a provider or they'll like let you travel and send someone with you to help you with your kid for like they don't like it's all included in their in their company. And everyone we talked to people about that specifically, and everyone we talked to, they just said like how just amazing it was, because they bring their kids with them to work, and then they it helps them too, because they have to like they close it at 5:30, and so basically they said they get there when daycare opens and they leave when daycare closes, and like that's how their day works. And so especially for the younger kids, they could go visit them at lunch and have that that space. And it was pretty amazing to see like how just bought in people were with that, and something very small. And then it was cool too, because there were some employees who had been in the daycare, and then they were like grown adult employees now, and going through like that system. But that's just another way I think they show kind of like that commitment to something that not a lot of other companies will do. And it's been a hot topic I've seen a lot of, and it is so really important. But yeah, it's kind of holistically, I think they're one of the examples of how you can maybe be a responsible corporation. Doug, you gonna open a child care for us here at Linfield? That's what you can do is in your retirement, right?
Well, we actually have childcare, kind of.
Oh yeah, that's right. We do, huh? Yeah.
And then, I've shared that with the colleges, we have flexibility, which is nice within your schedules, where, a lot of our coaches have young kids, and I love having kids around as long as it doesn't impede what you're doing. A lot of times being able to coach is in the college level that you have flexibility and your kids are welcome, but that's tough too.
Yeah.
I always think about nonprofit is like Keaton says, is volunteers and free work, because my wife used to work for the U.S. Senator Hatfield, but she was part of nonprofit organizations like Salem Kaiser School Foundation and the Awesome 3000. And she basically, she didn't make any money, but she volunteered to help the schools. And I always think America's kind of backwards, is that when you're doing a service for people or kids, you should be a priority of money, pay. So she's teaching now and her salary is no different when I made 20 years ago. It hasn't gotten better. It's just strange for me. It's actually sad, really.
Yeah, it is. But Keaton and Andy, they're going to change that.
But to answer your question, when I retire, work is going to be fun work, like working at a golf course so I can have free golf lessons, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
There you go. I love it. Keaton, do you mind sharing a little bit about, before we get off, about the company you're working for your capstone?
Yeah, so I'm actually glad you asked. I love talking about the company, but I already told Andy. I think I told everyone that I come into contact with, and I'm going to go to work for him after we work with him. But so for our capstone project, we got broken up into groups to basically consult with different nonprofits or for-profits as well, just around the world that we've been kind of partnered with. And so me and Alana got partnered with this nonprofit in Cape Town, South Africa called Surf Pop. And it was founded in 2015 by Daniel Botha, he was like a semi-professional surfer, grew up in Cape Town and really he went through, just experienced the separation that apartheid had on the towns and the creation of townships and the poverty that's all over every township. And so he created, what he was looking at was that these kids really don't have an outlet to do anything after school. Like as soon as they leave school, he said they literally just would like join a gang in the town, and that was their life. And so he created this company called Surf Pop, where he now has, I think, 40 kids every day. So he has 2 days a week. He picks them up in a bus and teaches them how to surf. And then 3 days a week, they're working in after school programs with him, learning about kind of like taking additional classes, but more like based around like life skills. And then they also learn about nutrition every day. They have like a garden that they grow and cook food out of. And they're looking to, our mission with them is to help them grow and kind of be able to take on more students. They have an application process, and like every year they get like 300% more than they can take on. And so they're looking how to accommodate all these kids. And that, if I'm sure Natalie already has like the website ready to put in the chat, but if you want to take a look at it, you can just look up Surf Pop. It's really cool. These kids, they just love it. I love how he used surfing as this tool to show these kids like a better life. And all they talk about is how confident it's made them, and how I think they just had, so they basically work with them from as soon as they enter school to as soon as they graduate, and like could go to university. And the first 2 kids that graduated the program just decided to come back and work for Surf Pop because it like changed their life. And so now they're doing that. So we met with him for the first time and are looking forward to working with him for the rest of the year, I guess.
Funny that you mentioned that. My experience with surfing in Hawaii is, hopefully you have some lessons about not cutting school to go surf when the surf's up. A lot of my friends that were surfers, when surf's up, they weren't in class. They went.
That was another thing that was wild about Patagonia too. Is like people went surfing on their lunch break. That was so cool. I was just like, oh man, what a dream.
It was sometimes surf's up in the morning or midday or afternoon. But anyway, that'll be a great experience, Keem.
Yeah, that should be fun.
Yeah, for some reason the website wasn't working for me, but people just can Google it and we'll be sure to share it. But really great job, you guys. I think this is a really important conversation and something to really keep in mind as we kind of move forward, just especially where we're at kind of economically in our country right now. Laura was wondering about the TED link.
Yeah, I'll send that right now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and then I don't know if we have anything for next week. Do you guys know?
Yes, let's see. Next week is, what's today? The 12th? Who gets the third week? I'll have to look at the calendar. But I'll send it out right after this.
Probably that 19th is what Thanksgiving break starts, right?
We're still gonna have one, right? Because I have Loop and Sage are gonna partner to
There you go.
do a talk next Friday.
That's what it is.
Yeah, they're gonna talk about the segregating sports by gender and some thoughts on that.
Ooh, I can't wait.
That's gonna be awesome.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Nat, I can't help but think this is kind of stuck in my head now, what you said about who's responsible for, these nonprofits are doing good things, but shouldn't someone else be higher up taking care of all these other problems that we're having socially? I mean, just.
Yeah.
responsible.
Yeah.
The TED Talk link, Laura.
Yeah. Awesome.
I got a 1 o'clock. Good job, you guys.
Yeah, I gotta run too, but it's great to see everybody. Happy Friday. Stay dry out there.
Yeah, seriously. We'll see you guys next week.
Okay, good job. See you next week.